Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us for what is intended to be a 40 to 45-minute session covering the amendments to the Employment Equity Act of 1998, and also the fact that there's a new earning threshold which has been implemented that in fact has been active since the 1st of March. So we're going to discuss those two issues in the course of today's presentation. So I want to start with this question to you, please. What is the Employment Equity Act and what is its purpose? Well, the Employment Equity Act was passed in 1998 and has been through a number of amendments. The primary purpose is to promote the right to equality and to ensure that all employees receive equal opportunities and that employees are treated fairly by their employers. It's essentially bringing the Human Rights Commission down to the workplace. It is the upper guardian of the constitutional protection for every employee, and the opposite is also true for every manager and owner as well in the workplace. As much as there can be an infringement of the Employment Equity Act by the employer against the employee, so equally there can be an infringement by employees against employers in the workplace. And I think that that's very, very important to consider. A core focus of the Employment Equity Act is the implementation of employment equity and affirmative action to redress the effects of historical discrimination. So there's no question about the fact that this is the instrument for social engineering in the workplace, for corporate re-engineering in the workplace post-1994, and there's nothing to hide it. It's never been hidden. This, in fact, is the purpose of the Employment Equity Act. While the Employment Equity Act applies to all employers, sections of it, particularly sections 12 to 27, only apply to what we refer to, or to who we refer to, as designated employers. And this is going to become quite important as we go along. The amendments to the Act bring about a change to the definition of what a designated employer is, to restrict the application of sections 12 to 27 of the Act, to restrict the applications of section 12 to 27 of the Act, specifically to a reduced group of employers, and to relieve some of the administrative burden on smaller employers. And I just want to stop for a second and say that there is a double-edged sword here, because you're going to see now that smaller employers are in fact given relief from this latest rewrite of the Employment Equity Act on the one hand. On the other hand, however, if they want to participate in the mainstream economy, they are going to need to comply, and we'll talk about that in a little while. The Employment Equity Act prohibits discrimination against an employee directly or indirectly in any employment policy or practice on the grounds of race, gender, pregnancy, marital status, family responsibility leave, ethnic or social origin, on the basis of color, on the basis of sexual orientation, on the basis of age, disability. And by the way, we're going to talk a little bit about changes to the definition of disability in this latest version of the Act as well. You can't discriminate against anyone on the basis of religion. You certainly cannot discriminate against anyone on the basis of HIV, or on the basis of how they enact, express, and live out their conscience, or in terms of their beliefs, what they believe or what they don't in fact believe in, on their political opinion, unless that political opinion inhibits productivity in the workplace. You cannot discriminate against a person on culture, certainly not language, and certainly not birth. Good. So those are the things that are specifically managed by the Employment Equity Act in terms of what you cannot do. So the question is, how will smaller employers be affected by the amendments? Well, the good news is that smaller employers are positively affected by this latest definition of what a designated employer is. The definition is amended to exclude employers who employ fewer than 50 employees. irrespective of their annual turnover. And this is the change. Previously, a designated employer was someone who may employ less than 50 people, but whose turnover is in fact higher than the prescribed minimum in the previous amendment to the Act. That's disappeared now. Now it's very simple. If you employ less than 50 people, you're excluded from the definition of being a designated employer in terms of this Act. Smaller employers will not be required to comply with the obligations of a designated employer, which relate to affirmative action, including the development and implementation of employment equity plans and reporting to and submission of those plans and reports to the Department of Employment and Labor. Sounds great. It sounds great until you consider that if you want to play with in the playpen with the people with big boys pants on, then in fact you are going to have to comply with employment equity requirements, even if you're a small business. And we'll come back to that. If I haven't answered your question in the course of the discussion, please feel free to raise it during question time. So this definition of designated employers and this saying that an employer employs less than 50 people is excluded from having to do an employment equity report, an employment equity plan, et cetera, significantly relieves the administrative burden on these employers. It exempts them from having to play in this area of affirmative action and employment equity. However, if they want to play in the area of government business at provincial, local, municipal government level or national, if they want to play with state-owned enterprises, if they want to play with companies that in fact are subject to municipal, provincial or national or SOE government tenders, then they are going to have to do something about affirmative action and employment equity in the workplace. While smaller employers will not be required to develop and submit employment equity reports, they will nevertheless be entitled to obtain a certificate of compliance under Section 53 of the Act. We'll talk about the certificate of compliance, but basically from the 1st of September, the Department of Employment and Labor will be offering certificates of compliance to those companies that wish to pre-qualify to play in provincial, municipal or national government work, or in fact state-owned enterprises, or in fact to supply any companies, be in the supply chain of any companies that in fact are supplying tenders for municipal, provincial, or national government tenders. So let's talk a little bit about disability. Well, there are changes in relation to disability in this latest version of the Act. And remember, you are required to have 2% of your workforce who are people with disability, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, but you're required to have 2% of your workforce who are people with disability, and you are required equally to have a 2% of people in the supply chain of your business who are, which are companies owned and operated by people with disability. So the definition of people with disabilities will be substituted to align with the definition in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which South Africa is a subscriber to. We're a signatory to. The amended definition includes, within the meaning of people with disabilities, people who have a long-term or recurring physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairment, which in interaction with various barriers may substantially limit their prospects of entry into or advancement in employment. Now, what this does is it redefines disability for the workplace. It says that historically the assumption, because it wasn't a fact, but it was an assumption that the Department of Labor did very little to do anything about, the assumption was that if you were in a wheelchair or you had any other kind of physical disability, you were disabled. However, it was absolutely silent as a definition about what is referred to as hidden disabilities. Hidden disability is a mental, intellectual, sensory impairment. It is something such as diabetes. It is something such as depression. It is something such as schizophrenia. It is something such as a heart disease. It is all of those weird and wonderful things that we cannot see in another person, which if you understand the extension of the definition of disabilities, you'll understand that up to about 30 to 40% of your actual current workforce are people with disabilities. And more importantly, I saw an amazing statistic put out by the Institute of Directors that simply because of stress, if nothing else, and diseases resulting from stress, up to 60% of your average board of directors in a listed company are people with notifiable hidden disabilities. An amazing thing to think about if you think about it like that. This enhanced definition accords with a more expansive international understanding of what constitutes disabilities. All right, so let's talk about the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is that the Department of Labor have, for the last 3 years, come out with an unveiled threat to businesses. They've said literally, and I've been in those meetings, but they've said to businesses, we have been working with you since 1998. We've invited you since 1998. We've invited you essentially 25 years. We've invited you every single year to come to the table and to talk to us about employment equity targets as government. And you've steadfastly not come to the table. You've steadfastly said employment equity, affirmative action is not something that's going to affect our business, not something that's going to happen. And so you've just gone on your merry way as business. This isn't me speaking, by the way, this is government speaking. But you've gone on your merry way, ignoring affirmative action, ignoring the concept of economically active populations that need to be compared against your company's profile, workforce profile, so that you can determine whether or not you're anywhere close to reflecting the economically active population of the country or the province that you're operating in. And so the minister has said, it's enough now. We've tried for 25 years. We are now coming in and we are stipulating that within particular sectors, and there are roughly about 25 sectors in total that have been worked on so far, but within particular sectors, we are not going to take this any longer, and we are going to establish and we are going to enforce, targets in those sectors to ensure that you get close in that sector to the economically active profile. So that ultimately at the end of the day, we're taking the ball out of the court of employers to say, well, we just can't find enough people of color who can be managers. We can't find enough people of color who can be trained up as artisans or apprentices. This is Department of Labor, not me speaking. So this is why the sectoral numerical targets have now been introduced. Section 15A introduces sectoral numerical targets. The purpose of this edition is to ensure the equitable representation of people from designated groups historically disadvantaged, people based on race, gender, and disability at all occupational levels in the workplace. The Minister of Employment and Labor is empowered to identify national economic sectors for purposes of the administration of the Employment Equity Act and to set numerical targets for each sector. It's done in consultation with the Employment Equity Commission, and all proposals in relation to identifying sectors, an industry or service or part of an industry or service, but all proposals and setting numerical targets for sectors will have to be published in order to afford interested parties a period of at least 30 days to comment on the proposals. Now, this has been going on for a period of time. In the construction sector, the last meeting took place 2 years ago. So it's not something that's going to be new. And the reality is that business is going to have to understand that government have stood back for 20 years. When they intended previously to want to implement these things, they stood back for 20 years, allowing industries to come to the party on their own and do something on their own rather than necessarily to be forced to do it in this way. But unfortunately, government have determined that industries just haven't played the game. So how will the sectoral numerical targets impact a designated employer's equity plan? How will the sectoral numerical targets impact the designated employer's employment equity plan? Well, an amendment to Section 20 of the Employment Equity Act dealing with employment equity plans.
Hello. Hi.
Hello.
It's speaking.
Yes, Paula.
Sorry?
Yes. Paula,
Yeah, I can hear you now.
what can I do for you?
Do you have, I'm looking for the Saltos, the CRDI.
Sorry?
Yeah, the auto.
I don't know what you're referring to.
Sorry, I think Paula's on another call, so I don't think
Oh.
she's referring to the meeting.
Oh, all right. Sorry. Okay, good. An amendment to Section 20 of the Employment Equity Act.
The CDRI is 1.5, isn't it?
Sorry, let me just see if I can just silence Paula just for a second, if I can find her here. Okay, Paula, I'm going to unfortunately have to mute you. There we go, muted. Right. So an amendment to Section 20 of the Act deals with employment equity plans, links the sectoral numerical targets to the numerical targets set by designated employer in its employment equity plan. So it's a test to make sure that you reference the employment equity plan to the targets which have been set by the minister, and in the absence of a set of targets for your industry, to the general economically active population targets, which are released by the department. A designated employer will be required to set numerical targets in line with applicable sectoral targets. An amendment to Section 42 aligns the assessment of compliance with employment equity with the new requirements in terms of sectoral numerical targets. So this is what the department is going to be checking for, to make sure that your sectoral numerical targets line up. So are sectoral numerical targets a quota? And this is a very interesting debate. The law distinguishes between a quota and a numerical target or goal. A quota is rigid or applied rigidly and amounts to job reservation. On the other hand, a target is a flexible employment guideline. So quotas are bad, targets are good as far as government is concerned. Quotas are prohibited because they constitute an absolute barrier to the future or continued employment or promotion of people who are not from a designated group. And the new section just let me deal with that last point though, because that's quite critical. If the sectoral targets were determined to be quotas, then they would be determined by our courts of law to be a barrier to the future or continued employment or promotion of people who are not from designated groups. In other words, people who are considered to be Black, Indian, colored, or Chinese people naturalized before 1994. You might have seen what's gone on with Dis-Chem and what the CEO of Dis-Chem put out about an absolute prohibition on the employment of any people who are white in any positions of authority, supervisory, or management in their company. And the response that he got and Dis-Chem got to that unfortunate statement, public statement, because in fact he was imposing a quota within his organization rather than a strategic target. And so this is the difference between quotas and numerical targets. Section 15A of the Act allows the minister to identify national economic sectors, set numerical targets for any national economic sector. It's a discretionary power and requires consultation, and this is critically important, consultation with the relevant sectors and advice of the Employment Equity Commission. Targets must be set to help achieve the purpose of ensuring equitable representation of suitably qualified people. It's a moving target. The outcome of this exercise should ideally result in the minister setting numerical targets based on the reality of the sector. In other words, the minister needs to be responsive to the sector. We have seen in discussion with the minister's Director General that the Director General has said, the reality of your sector cannot be about the fact that you cannot find people who are Black to come into positions of authority in your business. We're not accepting that. So that doesn't represent the reality of your sector. You've done nothing for 20 years to change that situation and put people in a position where they could be promoted into those positions. You can't use it now. So you take into account the composition of the workforce with the sector and the shifting needs for certain skills or proficiencies. The targets are neither arbitrary nor rigid. At least that's what the Department of Labor are saying. Although I must tell you, my experience on some of those 25 sectors, watching the engagements between business, labor, and government, my feeling is that they are far more rigid than they are arbitrary, and that they are less shifting than they are rigid. But I can understand government's exasperation in saying to business, we've given you so long, we're not giving you any more now, time to get this right. But however, my feeling is that it is definitely a quota system and not a target system. So changes in relation to submission of employment equity reports and the timing of submissions. Well, an amendment to Section 21 of the Act deals with employment equity reports and annual submissions of reports by a designated employer, and it removes a specific date for annual submissions. The amendment empowers the minister to make regulations with regard to the requirements of employers in submitting their employment equity reports and the timing of submission. So you're likely to see that for each of those 25 engaged with sectors, the submission dates might be different. And do the amendments offer any clarity relating to designated employers' obligations to consult with the trade union? Now, this is very interesting. Here you are in your company in a participative management relationship with the people who work in your business, where there happens to be a trade union on the sidelines. One would imagine that the trade union should be included in discussions you have with your employees about employment equity. But the new changes say this: an amendment to Section 16 of the Act clarifies the consultation process between the designated employer and its employees. Where there's a representative trade union, the designated employer must only consult with the trade union and not with its employees.
Huh?
So where there is a trade union, this amendment to the Act cuts your employees out of the consultation process and assumes that the trade union are 100% mandated on behalf of the employees, but the employees have no role in engagement on employment equity in the workplace. The consultations relate to the implementation of an employment equity plan in the company, the analysis conducted by the designated employer to identify employment barriers which adversely affect people from the designated groups, and the content and submission of the employment equity report. I am shocked by the fact that I've not heard any response from organized business, be it a Black Leadership Association, be it Business Unity South Africa, be it any association of employers in any industry in the country, coming back and saying to government, why have you and the trade unions cut the people who work for us out of the engagement on employment equity? There's something capturing about this. There's something corrupt about this practice, that you would set the trade union up as the principal partner of the company, as opposed to the people who work in that company. Not even the shop stewards are to be involved in this process in terms of the reading of Section 16. So you need to be aware of this. You need to clarify it with your trade unions, and you need to pressurize your trade unions into ensuring that the shop stewards are present when you have any discussions on employment equity in the workplace. So, Section 36 of the Act revives the power of labor inspectors to secure an undertaking to comply from a designated employer. In the old days, those powers of labor inspectors to get you to agree to implement certain things relating to employment equity in your workplace were taken out of the Act. But now it's been put back into the Act, which means that labor inspectors, and we heard that the Department of Labor have employed over 500 labor inspectors and intend to make that 1,500. But these labor inspectors are entitled to come into your workplace, interrogate your employment equity plans and your reports. And more importantly, if they find out that you're not complying with your sectoral targets or the economically active profile of the country, which is published by the department, to get you to actually sign an undertaking to change things immediately and not to leave it up to the negotiating process in the workplace. That's quite severe. An amendment to Section 37 empowers the minister to make regulations regarding the manner of service of compliance orders in relation to the affirmative action aspects of the Employment Equity Act on you, the designated employer. And it provides that a labor inspector may serve a compliance order on you, the designated employer, if you fail to comply with any of those sections. But it excludes Section 15 and Section 15A, which means that a failure to comply with 15 or 15A, the sections relating to numerical targets, may not be penalized by the means of a compliance order. So if you're doing anything else that's wrong in terms of employment equity, they can essentially compel you to do things immediately to correct the situation. However, if it's to do with numerical targets, they're taking an enabling approach, at least for the next couple of years, to you, the designated employer. Section 42 of the Act is amended to include an assessment of whether an employer has complied with the sectoral targets. So you'll go through an assessment. And if after the assessment, it's determined that the employer has failed to comply. So you can be directed by the labor inspector to have to go through the assessment, but not to have to correct your numerical targets. It's only after the assessment. If after the assessment, it's determined that you failed to comply, Section 45 states that the Director General may apply to the Labor Court for an order directing you to comply. And if you fail to justify your non-compliance with the request or recommendation, the Director General can impose a fine in accordance with the schedule. Now, in the circumstances, non-compliance with sectoral targets will have the same effect as non-compliance with an employment equity plan. So please don't ignore this. This is critically important, and you've got to be aware the Department of Labor are looking for companies, and particularly for companies that are not level 1 or 2 companies. And let's be honest, what I'm saying is traditionally white-owned companies. They're looking for white-owned companies, not only to issue non-compliance orders against, but in fact to get the labor court to compel you, and they're looking for companies that they can impose a fine in accordance with the schedule with. And that will automatically exclude you from being able to get a compliance certificate in September. And if you can't get a compliance certificate in September, you will not be able to supply provincial, local, or national government tenders or state-owned enterprises or any company that supplies those tenders. So these are the sectors that already have been consulted. And as you can see there, as far as coatings is concerned, the one that comes closest is the construction sector and also the wholesale and retail sector, which have been consulted already. The chemical sector is in the process of being consulted. Tim Nkalipi is the acting director general. He's one of the most outspoken people in the Department of Employment and Labor on the amendments to the Employment Equity Act. These are some of the things he's said. The amendments will empower the Employment and Labor Minister to regulate sector-specific targets and to regulate compliance criteria to issue compliance certificates in terms of Section 53 of the Act. From the 1st of September, to play in the tender space or to supply companies playing in the tender space, you will have to get a Department of Employment and Labor compliance certificate in terms of Section 53 of the Act. The organizations that do business with the state will have to be in good standing when it comes to compliance with employment equity. Even businesses that do not necessarily deal directly with the state will need to comply with the law. And the implication for employers is that if you have an employment equity plan in place, it will be affected by the setting of targets, and you will have to revisit your targets prior to the 1st of September 2023. The amendments will come into force on the 1st of September 2023. Any questions on what I've presented to you? Anyone want to ask anything? No question. Sorry? Was that someone asking a question? Oh, Sharon, I see your hand is up.
Good morning. I just joined a few minutes ago. Apologies, I just got back from another meeting. Sharan Moodley from Exalta Plascon, HR Manager. I'm not too sure where we are with the presentation, but I do have a question in relation to reporting.
Yes.
And I don't know if you're still going to get to that, but my question is, our company is due to our plan because it's coming to an end on the 31st of May of this year. So I just want to check if it is that we need to do our plan, how do I submit the plan? Do I submit the plan now despite the changes happening the 1st of September? Or do I report on extend my plan until the 1st of September and then apply for my new plan, the 5-year plan? I'm just a bit confused. I'm not too sure. Do I just do my plan and submit the new plan?
So thanks, Sharon.
June? Yes.
So just in response to you, so none of the sectoral targets have been gazetted yet, which means that if you're in the process of developing and submitting plans, you'll do it on the same basis that you've done it previously, on the understanding that the moment there is a new set of targets, you can either apply to the Department of Labor that those targets will only take effect from when your plan ends for the next one to begin. It's highly unlikely that they'll give you that exemption, but you apply for that exemption nevertheless. Or you accept that as soon as there is a gazetting of those sectoral targets, you will redo your plan in terms of those sectoral targets.
Which will be the 1st of September.
Well, it might be before the 1st of September. So
okay, I got you.
What the Department of Labor have said is that as soon as they've finalized the gazetting of the sectoral targets, they've published the gazetting of the sectoral targets for 30-day consultation. And they've then responded to the consultation and republished. That republishing then becomes the sectoral target. Okay.
So that
and what we will do, what we will do
Yes.
at SAPMA is make sure that as soon as there is a publication for comment for the 30-day period, we will let all our members know. And then obviously when there is a final gazetting of those sectoral targets, we will again let our members know.
Okay, that would be great. Then for now, I'll just report as normal and do the 5-year plan and submit.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Sharon. Anybody else want to ask a question? Aggie, is your hand up? No. All right, good. So let's now move on to the next section, ladies and gentlemen, and that is this section over here. And that is the new annual threshold relating to the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. So there is an increased annual threshold, as you know. In fact, the threshold has come into play on the 1st of March. Determined by the Minister of Employment and Labour, it's 241,110 Rand 59 cents. Now, what that means is that essentially anyone below that level is subject to the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, the majority of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. Everyone earning above that level is somehow exempt from many of those conditions unless they are individually repeated in letters of appointment or conditions of service in the company. Employees earning in excess of that threshold are excluded from the provisions which regulate everything from ordinary hours of work to overtime, compressed working weeks, averaging of hours of work, meal intervals, daily and weekly rest periods, Sunday pay, pay for night work, pay for work on public holidays. So unless there's a specific express agreement between you and people earning more than 241,000 Rand a year in your company, they are exempt from what the Basic Conditions of Employment Act have to say about all of these things. So, and I'm going to quote here from Cliff Decker-Hofmeyr, a couple of things they've had to say. This effectively means that there will now be more people who are not protected by the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. Employers and staff should ensure that they understand the impact of this on employees affected by the change, as it could have a material influence on salary expectations and everything else, especially in cases where there is a reasonable amount of overtime, night or weekend work. Now, before you jump up with joy, please bear in mind that there is a law of contract implication here, and that is as follows. Even if a person is excluded from being covered by the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, if there is custom and practice that you pay them overtime pay, you pay them a shift allowance, etc., 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 all of those weird and wonderful things covered by the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, and you unilaterally change their conditions of employment just because of a piece of legislation, the fact that you've been paying them isn't just because of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. It's become part and parcel of the contract you have with them. So you cannot just unilaterally do it. It's going to have to be done by agreement in some way or another in the workplace. With regards to the Labour Relations Act, employees earning in excess of the earning threshold are not subject to provisions around labour brokers and being deemed employees for the purpose of the Labour Relations Act. In other words, after 3 months, the labour broker and the employer jointly and severally are liable. They're both employers of the individual who is being sold to you by a labour broker. Except if they fall over the threshold, the Basic Condition of Employment Act threshold, then you can continue to regard the labour broker as their employer. Now that's entrenched in this regulation. In addition to this, employees earning in excess of the earnings threshold fall outside the scope of provisions relating to fixed-term employees who are deemed to be employed indefinitely after 3 months, in the absence of justifiable reasons for fixing the term of the contract. So you can enter into fixed-term contracts with employees above their threshold, but not below that threshold for the period after the first 3 months. So they say this: looking at the Employment Equity Act, an employee earning in excess of the earning threshold who has a dispute under Chapter 11 of the Employment Equity Act relating to unfair discrimination is not permitted to go to the CCMA for arbitration unless the dispute relates to alleged unfair discrimination on the grounds of sexual harassment, or the parties agree to arbitration at the CCMA. So if a party doesn't agree to arbitration at the CCMA, the employees are obliged to refer the dispute to the Labour Court for adjudication. So the person earning above that threshold is really on their own. They're subject to the Labour Relations Act, but they're subject to the condition of to their contract of employment rather than automatically being covered by the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. These amendments came in on the 1st of March. Any questions about this? Anyone want to comment or ask a question either on this or on anything that's previously been covered? No one? All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we will endeavor to continue to keep you appraised and updated as we go along, in the hope that that you can at least rely on SAPMA and the Surface Coating Employer Association for information relating to the Labour Relations Act, Basic Conditions of Employment Act, BEE, whatever it is which affects the employment relationship. Our job is to make sure that you're kept appraised and apprised of what you're supposed to be doing in your workplace. We're very happy as well to organize to come into the workplace, talk to managers, explain to them what's going on here, explain to them how employment equity is changing. And in fact, we're also quite happy to come in and by appointment talk to your employment equity committees on these changes and the various roles. We encourage you not to accept the unilateral imposition of trade unions on your company just because the tripartite relationship of government, government, COSATU, and the SACP have managed to create a piece of legislation excluding your workforce from engaging on anything to do with employment equity just because the trade union is around. We encourage you to fight back on that, to resist it and not to accept it, because it's nonsense. Thank you so much for attending, and we'll see you next time around.
Great, thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.